Hi everybody, welcome to Human Bio Lab 10 Cardiovascular System. I'm Taylor Che. I'm one of the human biology professors for the Thursday afternoon and Friday morning sections and the lab manager, and I'll be doing the lectures for this weird time that we're in. Hope you're all doing well, staying safe. If there's anything we can do to make this class easier and to help you get things done, please let me or your other professors know as soon as possible. If you don't have internet access, you can't get assignments done in time, things happen, you get sick, please let us know and we will make accommodations. We want to help you as much as possible. So, starting on a lighter note, today I was walking with my dog outside and took what I thought was a gorgeous photo of her on the left, and then she started shaking to scratch something, and the photo on the right is what is going on there. Kind of how everyone's probably feeling a little restless, a little crazy-eyed, so hopefully we can alleviate some of your worries and help you get through this. So please let us know what we can do. Hopefully this lightens your mood a little bit too. So the plan for today, we're going to do the cardiovascular lab, which is lab 10 in the lab manual. We're going to start by talking about the anatomy of the cardiovascular system, talk about how blood flows through your body, how we use EKGs to measure heart rate, and see if there's problems with your heart, talking about blood pressure, and then we'll talk about the models that are in your lab manual and go over the homework that's due for next week. So this is on page 72 in the lab manual, talking about the anatomy of the cardiovascular system. So big proponent of our class is homeostasis, right? That's the main point that we learn about most of the time. And with the cardiovascular system, it supplies each system of your body, each organ, with just the right amount of blood in order to maintain homeostasis. If we didn't have homeostasis, we wouldn't work well. And we'll talk more about homeostasis in regards to blood pressure as well. So you have a couple different parts that we want to talk about. First, the arteries and their arterioles. So arteries have oxygen-rich blood, and they carry blood away from your heart. So you can think artery away. It starts with the same letter. They also have the highest blood pressure. Now, arterioles are just smaller arteries that kind of come down from arteries, and they don't usually have names. If you've heard of like the femoral artery or the brachial artery, those are big arteries like these. Arterioles don't have names. They come down into the capillaries. Think of it as it's kind of like a tree trunk. It has huge branches, and then they go to smaller branches and smaller ones. The capillaries are these very small, narrow blood vessels with lower blood pressure, and they are for exchange. So cells need nutrients and oxygen from the arteries, and then they get rid of their carbon dioxide and waste and send them to the venules and the veins. So it's like an exchange area that's happening. Venules and veins, they take blood back to the heart, it returns to the heart, and they are oxygen poor. So here we have the venules, no name again, very small, branches off into the vein, and veins have names. So like this is the vena cava. It actually comes, we have one down here, the inferior, and then the superior up here. And veins have names as well. Just like how you have a femoral artery, you have a femoral vein. Now we often depict veins and arteries with different colors, red for oxygen rich and blue for oxygen poor. That's not necessarily always true. Page 72, we have our heart model, and your heart is the main feature of the cardiovascular system. It pumps between 5 and 25 liters of blood per minute, and if you were to live for 75 years, your average beats per minute would be 75, and it would beat about 2.8 billion times in your lifetime. Your brain controls your heartbeat, but your heart can also beat without instructions from the brain. So even people who are brain dead, their hearts are beating as well. Things that people don't often think of with your heart is it has what we call the cardiac conduction system, which initiates and distributes electrical impulses throughout your heart. For example, you have the sinoatrial node, or the SA node, and that is up here. You won't be able to see it in the model, but basically it initiates the heartbeat and it's influenced by the brain to speed your heartbeat up or slow it down. You also have some other nodes. You have the AV node right here, the atrioventricular node, and that also is involved in the electrical cardiac conduction system in your heart. We'll talk about flow of blood in a minute, but basically some key features: right atrium, right ventricle, left atrium, left ventricle. The ventricles are in the lower part. They're this thick, huge muscle right here that are the power source. When blood is being pumped, it forces it, and when we measure blood pressure and when we look at the EKG, they're huge little peaks on a graph that we see, and that's because they're so powerful, they're so strong. The atria are up here in the top, and atria, I think of like you have an atrium, it's a tiny room, and so they're kind of smaller, right and left. This is your pulmonary artery or the pulmonary trunk, and it goes from your right ventricle to your lungs. We think another word for lungs is pulmonary, or if you have like a pulmonary embolism, that's in your lungs. So it goes to your lungs, gets oxygen, and then comes back. These are your pulmonary veins, comes back to the heart. And then this is your aortic arch. And this is what we mentioned in the previous slide, the vena cava, the vein coming back to your heart. Fun fact, the lub-dub you hear when you're listening to a heart, lub-dub, is the different valves closing. So you have valves here and here. You have the tricuspid and the mitral valve, and those are making the lub sound. They are closing, so it's forcing blood from the right atrium and the left atrium into the ventricles, and then they close so that blood doesn't backflow. You don't want it to bubble back because that's bad. The dub sound you're hearing is the pulmonary valve, which is here in the pulmonary arteries, and the aortic valve, which you can't see right here. Those are closing, keeping the blood from going back to the flowing back into this atrium, ventricle, or in this ventricle. So the lub-dub are the sounds of the valves closing. So one easy way to think about it too is you have the right side, which it looks like your left side to you, but if it were in your body, this would be on your right side, this would be on your left side. The right side is oxygen poor. It's coming back from the body and it doesn't have oxygen in it. And the left side is oxygen rich because it's come back from the lungs. We talked about how arteries take blood away and they're oxygen rich, and veins are usually oxygen poor and carry blood back. This is important to note that your pulmonary artery right here is oxygen poor. It's coming from the right side. It hasn't gone to the lungs, so it doesn't have oxygen, but we call it an artery because it's taking blood away from the heart and going to the lungs. So the pulmonary arteries and veins, a great exception. Like I said, arteries, blood away from the heart, and they're usually oxygen rich. Veins, blood back to the heart, usually oxygen poor. But your pulmonary arteries, which are right here going to your lungs, actually carry blood away from the heart to the lungs, which is why we call them arteries, but they're oxygen poor. There's no oxygen there because they're going to the lungs. Once gas exchange happens in the lungs, they return back to the heart through the pulmonary veins. Again, we call them veins because the blood's returning to the heart, but in this case, the pulmonary veins are oxygen rich. So it doesn't necessarily mean every time that arteries have oxygenated blood and veins have deoxygenated blood, but in general, that pattern is true. So again, pulmonary arteries and veins, the great exception. Now let's talk a little bit about blood flow. This is a nice diagram showing you that we have two different circuits of blood. We have the pulmonary circuit, which again means lungs, and we have the systemic circuit, which is about your whole body, your body system. So if we start in the heart, we have blood coming back from the body, and it's deoxygenated, and we're denoting it with blue blood. So it comes back to the right atrium, it goes into the right ventricle, and then it goes into the pulmonary artery. Now the artery, again, this is the unique one that is oxygen poor. It goes up into the lungs on either side. We have gas exchange happening. This is the pulmonary loop. Goes back to the heart. Both sides come together into the left atrium, then the left ventricle, and then they go out the aorta, and then they go to the rest of the body. They give oxygen and nutrients to all the cells, and then they take away carbon dioxide and waste and bring it back to the heart. So the pulmonary loop is where it goes right side of the heart to the lungs and back, and the systemic loop is left side of the heart and then to the rest of the body until it comes back. So again, pulmonary, lungs, systemic, rest of your body. You also have coronary arteries and veins, a coronary system. You need to supply blood to your heart in order to keep it pumping as well. A lot of people don't think about that. Your heart needs 1/20th of your blood flow, so it needs its own blood supply in order to keep pumping blood to the rest of the body. So you have the coronary arteries. One thing I just want to point out is about pulses. This is again on page 73, focusing mainly on the names, systole and diastole. Systole is contraction, diastole is relaxation. We'll be talking more about that with blood pressure specifically. Just something to be keeping in mind for right now. So moving on to the EKG. An EKG is an electrocardiogram. Now you're going to be like, why is it an ECG? It is an ECG, EKG for German. So it's an electrocardiogram, and it measures voltage at the surface of the body, basically measuring the differences in voltage. If you've ever had an EKG, they put like 10 different sensors on your whole body to measure all over to see if everything's going well. And it's measuring that electrical conduction system that we talked about at the beginning with the different the nodes in your heart. So this is a typical wave that we see on an EKG, and each thing means something different. The P wave is when the atria are contracting. So remember, the atria are those two small little chambers on the top of the heart, and so when they contract, we're not seeing a huge leap because they're pretty small. We have a QRS wave, which is QRS, we consider it one wave together, and that is when the ventricles are contracting. And it's huge, right? Because the ventricles have that thick muscle, so they're really squeezing that blood out. And the ventricles have to squeeze blood to your lungs and then to the rest of your body. So they really need to have that power, and that's why their peak is so big. The T wave is when the ventricles relax. And while it's a smaller wave than this, you can think relaxing is less of a force than contracting. So it still is very small. But then you may be wondering, where's the atrial relaxation? We have atrial contracting, we have ventricles contracting, and we have the ventricles relaxing. Well, the atria are actually relaxing right around here. We just can't see it because it's so small, and this peak is so huge. So we use EKGs to see if there's problems, if your heart's not beating, or if, not if your heart's not beating, if different parts aren't working as well. If you have a heart attack, you may see changes here because it's not working as it should. We can also use the EKG to calculate heart rate, and that's what we're going to do in this class. So this is on page 74, and this is going to seem a little confusing, but what we're going to do is we're going to walk through it. I'm going to give you an example that we'll do together, and then you're going to do one on your own for homework. So to start, this is the machine that we normally use. It's called Vernier Lab Pro, and basically we're measuring the EKG, measuring your electrical impulses of your heart for 3 seconds. So you can see here is 0, 1, 2, 3. Those are our seconds. And this is the electrical potential that we're measuring. So you can see we have the little peaks that we mentioned. P, QRS, T, P, QRS, T, P, QRS, T. So you can see that we have multiple happening over 3 seconds. But we want to know what is the heart rate. Basically in beats per minute is what we measure heart rate in. So the first thing we do is we measure the distance between the R peaks, which is this top peak. Remember, this is Q, R, and S. So these are our R peaks. So we would measure the distance between them in millimeters. And if you have multiple, like sometimes if the heart's beating really fast, you'll have multiple R peaks, like 5 or 6. So what you would want to do is measure the distance between them, and then you would want to average them. So divide them by the number of peaks you had. So this is our X millimeters per beat. So basically we're trying to figure out the difference between the R peaks. That's step 1. So this EKG, again, is over 3 seconds. If you were to measure from 0 to 1, or 1 to 2, or 2 to 3, it would be 40 millimeters total. And that is a constant we use for all of our examples in this whole class. So we know the distance between 0 and 1 seconds is 40 millimeters, and we know the distance between our R peaks, we just measured that. But what we want to know is how can we convert millimeters basically to beats per minute. So this is our equation that we use. 1 second over 40 millimeters is equal to Y over X millimeters per beat. Now the X millimeters per beat, you'll remember, is the average distance between the R peaks. So we know that, but we want to know how many seconds basically are in the in that time. That's step 2. Then what we do is we take this equation and we fill it out to get beats per minute. There's 60 seconds in a minute, and we know how many seconds are happening in one beat. So from here to here, we just calculated that. How many beats per minute are we getting? So let's walk through an example. So again, 1 second is 40 millimeters. That is constant. We know that all the time. And I already measured the distance between some R peaks for you, and the average distance is 35 millimeters. That is our X millimeters per beat. So I filled in our equation. 1 second over 40 millimeters is equal to Y, which is what we're solving for, over 35 millimeters per beat. What you do then is you cross multiply. So 40x is equal to 35, and then you would divide both by 40 to isolate y. So y is equal to 0.875. Then I would fill in this equation. There's 60 seconds in a minute, and we calculated y, which is 0.875 seconds per beat. The seconds cross out, so you get beats per minute. And here we have z. You basically divide 60 by 0.875, and z is 69 beats per minute. So that is how we use EKGs for solving heart rate. This example is one you'll do on your homework assignment as a bonus. So there's 1 second is 40 millimeters, again, a constant. The average distance in this example between R peaks is 50 millimeters. So this is a bigger distance between them. So maybe you'll notice a pattern that as the peaks get smaller, you have a faster heart rate, and as the peaks get longer, the distance between, you have a slower heart rate. So this should be interesting to see. Okay. Moving on to blood pressure. So blood pressure, you may have had your blood pressure measured before with the cuff, or sometimes they'll it's automatic and it automatically blows up. So basically with blood pressure, what we're looking at is the force of blood exerting on the walls of your blood vessels. So what is the pressure going on there? Literally blood pressure. So I mentioned systole and diastole earlier, contracting and relaxing, and we see that as well here. So systolic pressure is your highest pressure, and it's from the Q wave to the end of the T wave. So here we have the ventricles contracting and the ventricles relaxing. So the highest pressure right here. And then you have diastole or diastolic pressure, which is your lowest pressure from the end of your T wave, so right here, to the start of your Q wave. So again, your ventricles are relaxed and your atria contract, so the lowest pressure. And we're specifically focusing on ventricles. When you're looking at blood pressure, it's mainly your ventricular pressure. You can measure pressure in other places, but we would normally use a blood pressure cuff, or the fancy word sphygmomanometer, but we'll call it a blood pressure cuff. And basically what's happening is you have your brachial artery, which is in your arm, is normal blood flow. We put the cuff on you and we pump it up really high using that bulb or an automatic one, so it constricts. We call it blood occlusion. Basically, your blood cannot flow down through the brachial artery. And then we slowly release the pressure and listen with a stethoscope to hear your pulse. When you can first hear your pulse, you check the little dial, and that is your systolic pressure, the highest pressure, right? The artery is just starting to become uncompressed, and so the blood is like, yes, go through. And so that is your highest pressure, your systolic pressure. Then you keep letting the pressure go down with the cuff. It slowly releases the pressure, and when you cannot hear a pulse anymore, that is your lowest pressure, right? It's almost back to normal. The blood is starting to flow more normally, and so that is your diastolic pressure, the lowest pressure. If you've ever had your blood pressure taken and they say, oh, it's 120/80, the 120 is the systolic and the 80 is the diastolic. 120 is the highest pressure, 80 is the lowest pressure. Hypotension, which is low blood pressure, is less than 100/60. And hypertension, which is high blood pressure, which can lead to an increased risk of heart attack and stroke because the pressure is so high, it's putting so much work on your heart. That we're looking at is higher than 130/90. So normal blood pressure, perfect blood pressure, is basically 120/80. Now let's talk about what that means with homeostasis. So blood pressure is a driving force for supplying blood to all parts of our body, and we regulate it by having our heart rate regulated, contracting, how strong the contractions are, and the diameter of the blood vessels themselves. We can use, and this again is on 75, we can use different nerves that release things, different hormones that help regulate heart rate and things like that. So you have parasympathetic and sympathetic nerves. Your parasympathetic nerves release acetylcholine, and that slows your heart rate. So if your heart rate's too fast or your blood pressure is too high, it will release acetylcholine, which will then slow your heart rate and lower your blood pressure in general. Sympathetic nerves release epinephrine. You may have heard of epinephrine if you like fight or flight, or if you have an EpiPen and you need that injected. It basically increases your heart rate, constricts those arterioles and arteries to increase your blood pressure. So that's how different nerves can regulate hemodynamics and help your homeostasis in your body. Now, let's talk about the models on 76 and 77. You will need to fill these in as homework. Things I want you to focus on is the heart. And so here we have the outside and here we have the outside removed. So things to focus on, you can see the coronary arteries and veins supplying the blood. You can see these little kind of tan things are the atria. This is the ventricles. And I'll leave it up to you to label which is right or left. Just remember, it's the opposite of what you think. Here we have the vena cava coming in with oxygen poor blood. Here we have the pulmonary arteries going out to the lungs to get oxygen. The pulmonary veins coming in with oxygen. And this is your aorta going up. And you can even, this right here is it coming all the way down. If you actually lay on the ground and kind of push right underneath your rib cage, don't do it too hard. You can feel your pulse and that your aorta goes all the way down there. This is it cut open, so you can see the atria in here, the ventricles here, more of the pulmonary trunk, and the aorta. So again, please label these. Let's talk about your homework. So you need to read Lab 10, finish this video, obviously. Congratulations, you did it. And label the figures on 76 and 77, the ones we just did. Make sure you finish the example that we had in here of calculating heart rate from the EKG, and it will be on your lab report as an answer. You need to do your exercise experiment, and we'll talk about that in a minute. Your graph of your exercise experiment will be due on Canvas. Now, please check Canvas to be sure of due dates. Dr. Matra and Dr. Wetzel are going to do different dates, potentially, since their class is on Thursday and mine is Thursday and Friday. So please double check with your professor to see when your assignments are actually due. My class, Thursday afternoon and Friday, everything will be due Friday at midnight. Your graph is 12 points. The rubric is on page 78. And then you'll also have the Lab 10 lab report due. It's on Canvas in the cardio folder. And again, it's either due on Thursday or Friday. My class is Friday at midnight. Next Friday, April 3rd. And that is worth 20 points. Now, I know it may sound like a lot of work, but it's open note, it's open video, it's open lab report. Fill it out and do it. It's worth it. We're going to have enough lab reports that it's going to be worth more than test 3 would have been. And now that we're not doing test 3, it's worth the points. So please make sure you're doing it, and please let us know if you have any questions about it. So talking more about your exercise and heart rate experiment. So this was the experiment we planned a few weeks ago where we were going to exercise and measure heart rate, very similar to the one where we did exercise and measuring body temperature, but doing heart rate instead, basically testing to see if exercising increases your heart rate. So grab a group of friends or family that you know, in safe proximity or social distancing, and do your experiment that you planned. You can measure heart rate using your wrist, or you can if you go up in your neck, you can push down and you can find it. You can even find pulses in a lot of different places, like in your ankle, and even in your femoral artery, which is near your hip, kind of. It's a little bit hard to find that one. But you can do that experiment. If you cannot find people to do the experiment for, please let us know. I'm willing to run around the block or quickly jaunt or just measure my resting heart rate. Please let us know if you need people to do this experiment for. So key components, measure your heart rate before and after. Or if you're doing it over time, make sure you're measuring it accurately. Like if you're doing it 1 minute, 2 minute, things like that. Make sure to use the correct graph. I had people last time with the body temperature one do the wrong graph. If it's over time, a scatter plot with lines is probably going to be best. But if you're doing before and after, a bar chart is really nice. The graph is due on Canvas next week, either April 2nd or April 3rd. Make sure you check Canvas. The rubric is on 76, 77, 78. It's also on Canvas for my classes. Please don't forget the figure captions. I've had people turn in the graph with no figure captions and you're missing lots of points. So please make sure to do the figure captions and submit in Microsoft Word because Excel breaks it up and it's hard to read. If you have any questions, please let us know as soon as possible. You have this whole week to get this done, and please contact us if you have questions. Please let us help you. Please stay safe and have a good rest of your week.